The funny thing about people who think they own everything is that they always celebrate too early. I knew something was wrong before I even reached the property line. The scent of freshly turned soil drifted through my truck's open window long before I saw the first excavator. Then came the steady hum of diesel engines, the sharp beeping of backup alarms, and the unmistakable applause of a crowd that had no business standing on my family's land. I eased my pickup onto the gravel shoulder and just stared. More than 100 mature maple and oak trees stood in perfect rows across the eastern meadow, each one supported by wooden stakes wrapped with bright green ribbons. Decorative stone paths curved between them. Brand-new irrigation lines glistened in the afternoon sun. White folding chairs faced a polished wooden podium decorated with balloons and banners that read, Ashbrook Estates Community Heritage Park, Grand Opening. For a moment, I honestly wondered if I had taken the wrong road. But the weathered fence my grandfather built in 1978 still stretched along the northern edge exactly where it always had. The old windmill still turned slowly beside the creek. Even the giant cottonwood where I carved my initials when I was 12 stood exactly where it belonged. Everything else had changed. My name is Caleb Thornton. I'm 41 years old, and I make my living solving infrastructure problems for counties that usually wait until something fails before calling someone like me. Roads, drainage systems, retaining walls, property surveys. I spend my days reading maps that most people glance at for 5 seconds before folding back into the glove compartment. Maybe that's why I notice details other people ignore, like the survey stakes that have been pulled out and tossed behind a trailer, like the irrigation trench that crossed a recorded property boundary by nearly 60 feet, like the expensive ornamental trees planted directly above a drainage easement that had existed longer than the subdivision itself. None of that happened by accident. Then I saw her. Victoria Ashcroft stepped onto the stage wearing a bright floral designer jacket that practically glowed against the summer sky. Oversized sunglasses perched perfectly on her face, expensive jewelry flashing every time she lifted a hand toward the crowd. She carried herself like she had personally invented the neighborhood. Even from across the field, I could smell the heavy perfume floating through the warm breeze. She smiled for photographs while shaking hands with local business owners and congratulating volunteers who had spent their Saturday landscaping property that didn't belong to them. Behind her, a massive stone monument displayed the words Property of Ashbrook Estates, HOA, in freshly engraved lettering. I almost laughed. Almost. A volunteer noticed my truck and whispered something into Victoria's ear. She turned, spotted me, and smiled with the kind of confidence that only comes from believing nobody will challenge you. She walked toward me across the brand-new stone walkway, her heels clicking against pavers that had been installed over my family's pasture. "Mr. Thornton," she said sweetly, "isn't it beautiful? We decided this unused field deserved to become something the entire community could enjoy." I looked past her toward the trees swaying gently in the breeze. They were healthy, expensive specimens. Someone had invested serious money into moving them here. I could hear children laughing near a decorative fountain that hadn't existed last month. Volunteers passed out lemonade, while a photographer captured smiling families standing beneath banners celebrating community improvement. Every single picture included land that had never belonged to the HOA. I reached into my truck, pulled out a rolled property survey, and held it without opening it. "Victoria," I said calmly, "this is still private property." She smiled even wider, almost amused. "Our attorneys disagree." I nodded once. No raised voice. No argument. No dramatic speech. Just one sentence. "Then I hope you kept every receipt." Her smile never disappeared, but I noticed her eyebrows tighten for the briefest moment. Around us, the ceremony continued. Cameras flashed. Children chased each other between trees that shouldn't have been there. County officials admired landscaping that had crossed legal boundaries nobody else seemed to recognize. I folded the survey back under my arm, climbed into my truck, and drove away without another word. In my rearview mirror, Victoria climbed back onto the stage as applause echoed across my grandfather's meadow. She thought she had just unveiled the neighborhood's proudest achievement. What she didn't realize was that she had also created the most expensive landscaping mistake Ashbrook Estates would ever make. The drive home gave me nearly 30 minutes to think, and by the time I pulled into my barn, the anger had settled into something much more useful. My grandfather used to tell me that emotions make terrible surveyors because they never measure straight. Facts do. Documents do. Boundaries do. That lesson stayed with me long after he was gone. His name was Walter Thornton, and he bought this 60-acre property in 1964 with money he earned building county bridges one steel beam at a time. He believed land should always be understood before it was improved. Every fence post, every drainage ditch, every tree line existed for a reason that most people never bothered to ask about. When I was a kid, Saturday mornings meant following him across dew-covered grass, carrying a measuring rod almost taller than I was. The smell of damp earth mixed with fresh coffee drifting from his old thermos is still one of the clearest memories I have. While other kids learned baseball statistics, I learned how to read contour lines, recognize flood channels, and understand why a property marker buried 6 inches below the surface could be worth more than an expensive truck if a disagreement ever started. At the time, I thought he was simply an old man obsessed with maps. Years later, I realized he was teaching me how to protect something that could not easily be replaced. That was exactly why I became a civil engineer. Most people imagine the job is about concrete and highways, but a surprising amount of it involves solving problems before they become disasters. Water always follows gravity. Soil always remembers pressure. Boundaries always matter, even when people pretend they do not. I have spent almost 2 decades helping counties avoid expensive mistakes by respecting details that everyone else overlooks. I have watched developers lose millions because they ignored one forgotten easement. I have seen expensive neighborhoods flood because someone decided an old drainage channel looked unnecessary. Experience teaches patience because nature eventually corrects every shortcut. My family property never looked impressive to outsiders. There was no mansion sitting on top of a hill. No decorative entrance gates, no fountains, just rolling pasture, a quiet creek, native grasses, clusters of mature trees, and a meadow my grandfather intentionally kept open. Every spring, heavy rainwater flowed across that section before disappearing into the creek exactly the way the original engineering plan intended. It was simple, efficient, and had worked for decades without anyone noticing because good infrastructure is usually invisible. Victoria clearly saw an empty field. I saw a system doing its job perfectly. That difference would eventually matter more than she could possibly imagine. I walked into the old equipment shed just before sunset. The familiar scent of machine oil, cedar lumber, and weathered leather wrapped around me like an old friend. Grandpa's drafting table still stood in the corner beneath the same brass lamp he had installed 40 years earlier. Most people would have cleaned the place out after inheriting it. I never could. Every cabinet still held carefully labeled folders arranged by year. Every survey map rested inside protective tubes. Every handwritten notebook remained exactly where he left it. Organization was another lesson he believed could save a person long after memories faded. I unlocked the lowest filing cabinet and pulled out the original property archive. Thick parchment surveys, county approvals, drainage calculations, utility records, easement agreements. Everything had been preserved with remarkable care. My fingers stopped on a folded topographic survey dated September 1978. I smiled without realizing it. I remembered helping Grandpa laminate that very document after he explained that paper only becomes valuable if it survives long enough to prove someone wrong. Outside, the evening breeze rustled through the remaining trees surrounding the barn, while distant birds settled into the woods. The contrast between that peaceful sound and the applause I had heard earlier that afternoon could not have been greater. One celebrated appearances. The other reminded me that real ownership is quiet. It does not need a microphone or a ribbon-cutting ceremony. It only needs patience, preparation, and the truth recorded long before anyone thinks about rewriting it. The next morning started before sunrise. The air carried that cool, earthy smell that only lasts for a few minutes before the Texas heat begins pushing it away. I poured a cup of black coffee, spread every survey across my grandfather's drafting table, and began building a timeline instead of an argument. That was another lesson my profession had taught me. People debate opinions. Paperwork tells stories. By 8 o'clock, I already knew exactly when the first construction equipment had entered my property, where every irrigation trench crossed the boundary line, and how many permanent improvements had been installed without permission. What I still wanted to understand was why someone would risk doing all of this so publicly. That answer arrived sooner than I expected. Around mid-morning, my phone buzzed with a message from my neighbor, Daniel Foster, who owned the cattle ranch west of mine. Attached was a photograph from the Ashbrook Estates community newsletter. Right there on the front page stood Victoria Ashcroft beside the stone monument, smiling beneath a headline announcing the beginning of a new era for neighborhood living. The article praised her vision, thanked volunteers for transforming neglected open space into a destination for families, and promised additional improvements over the coming months, including picnic areas, walking trails, and seasonal festivals. The article never once mentioned my family or the fact that every single improvement sat on privately owned land. Daniel added only one sentence beneath the photograph. "I figured you should see this before everyone else does." I thanked him and kept reading. Victoria had built an impressive public narrative. According to the newsletter, the meadow had supposedly been abandoned for years. She described it as wasted space that lowered surrounding property values and claimed the homeowners association had stepped in to restore beauty and encourage community engagement. Reading those words almost made me smile. I had been maintaining that property every season. The grass was intentionally managed to support natural drainage. The open field existed by design, not neglect. Someone unfamiliar with engineering might see an empty meadow. Victoria saw an opportunity to create a legacy with someone else's property. That afternoon, I drove past the community clubhouse instead of entering my own land. Luxury sport utility vehicles lined the parking lot, while gardeners unloaded fresh flowers from trailers. Workers installed matching benches painted dark green. Everything looked polished, organized, and expensive. Victoria stood near the entrance giving instructions with a tablet in one hand and an iced coffee in the other. Even from across the parking lot, I recognized the same oversized sunglasses, the bright designer outfit, and the confident posture that suggested she had never heard the word no. She pointed toward a landscaping crew, adjusted a decorative scarf around her shoulders, and greeted residents as though she were hosting a charity gala instead of directing work on property that belonged to someone else. Nobody questioned her because confidence has a strange way of disguising bad decisions. I remained inside my truck and simply watched. Within 20 minutes, I noticed 3 different contractors arriving. One delivered decorative lighting. Another unloaded pallets of stone edging. A third brought additional ornamental trees wrapped in burlap. Every delivery generated invoices. Every installation created new expenses. Every improvement deepened the association's financial commitment. Victoria believed she was increasing the value of the neighborhood. In reality, she was multiplying the cost of reversing everything later. Before leaving, I noticed something even more interesting. A professional camera crew interviewed Victoria beside the entrance monument while several board members applauded behind her. She proudly explained that the project represented responsible leadership and long-term planning for future generations. She spoke with complete certainty because she genuinely believed ownership could be replaced by popularity. As I drove away, the afternoon sun reflected off the polished stone monument until it almost disappeared in the glare. My grandfather used to say that the brightest objects often cast the darkest shadows because they distract people from looking at what lies underneath. Victoria had invested all of her attention into appearances. I was quietly documenting facts. Those 2 paths were moving toward the same destination, but only one of them was built on solid ground. By the end of the week, the meadow no longer looked like the quiet piece of land I had known my entire life. Fresh mulch covered the ground with a sharp cedar smell that drifted across the pasture every afternoon. Newly installed sprinkler heads clicked on with mechanical precision just before sunset, sending arcs of water across decorative flower beds that had appeared almost overnight. Small children laughed as they wandered between the young trees, while their parents complimented the homeowners association for creating such a beautiful gathering place. Every smiling photograph posted online made the same silent claim that the property belonged to the community now. I never interrupted them. Instead, I documented everything. Every morning, I parked along the county road with a camera and a notebook. Delivery trucks arrived carrying more benches, more landscape lighting, more stone borders, and even decorative signs identifying different species of trees. I recorded license plate numbers, contractor names printed on truck doors, delivery times, and photographs showing exactly where every improvement had been installed. My engineering background had taught me that details become evidence long before anyone realizes they matter. Around noon on Friday, a certified envelope appeared inside my mailbox. I recognized the Ashbrook Estates logo before I even opened it. The paper carried the faint smell of fresh printer ink, and the language inside sounded exactly like Victoria herself. According to the letter, my property had officially become part of the association's Community Enhancement Initiative. It thanked me for my cooperation, informed me that the improvements increased surrounding property values, and included an invoice requesting payment for my share of landscaping expenses along with future maintenance assessments. I actually read the entire document twice just to make sure I had not misunderstood it. They were asking me to help finance improvements they had placed on my own land without permission. I placed the letter into a plastic document sleeve beside every other piece of evidence. Less than an hour later, my phone rang. Victoria's cheerful voice arrived before I could even say hello. She asked if I had received the welcome package and explained that the board hoped I would become an active partner in supporting the neighborhood's exciting future. I listened quietly while she described upcoming concerts, seasonal festivals, and outdoor movie nights planned for the meadow. When she finally paused, I answered with the same calm voice I had used from the beginning. I told her the property remained privately owned, that I had never granted permission for any construction, and that I was formally requesting every new installation be removed. She laughed softly, almost as though I had made an innocent joke. She said the project had overwhelming community support and suggested I should be proud that my land was finally serving a meaningful purpose. Before ending the call, I informed her that my request would also be delivered in writing. She wished me a pleasant afternoon and hung up without another word. That evening, I drafted a formal notice. Every sentence was factual. Every property description matched the recorded surveys. Every boundary reference corresponded to county records. I requested immediate removal of every tree, every irrigation line, every sign, every bench, and every structure placed beyond the legal boundary. I mailed copies by certified delivery to the Homeowners Association, each board member, and the contractors whose names I had documented throughout the week. Then I waited. Monday morning brought the answer. Another convoy of trucks rolled into the meadow. Instead of removing anything, they unloaded even more landscaping materials. Workers planted additional ornamental trees while another crew installed decorative pathway lights that glowed softly beneath the branches after sunset. Victoria herself walked through the project carrying architectural renderings, smiling for photographs as if my letters had never existed. She did not ignore my warnings because she had failed to receive them. She ignored them because she believed public enthusiasm would outweigh private ownership. Standing beside the old fence at sunset, I listened to the quiet hiss of the irrigation system and watched water soak into soil that had been carefully engineered decades earlier to remain open for a reason. They saw beautiful landscaping. I saw expensive improvements settling deeper into a legal problem that grew larger with every shovel of dirt they added. 3 days later, I walked into the county records office carrying a weathered leather portfolio that had belonged to my grandfather. The familiar scent of old paper, floor polish, and fresh coffee filled the lobby while clerks quietly sorted stacks of deeds behind the counter. I had been inside that building dozens of times over the years for engineering projects, and I knew exactly what I was looking for. I was not searching for proof that I owned the land because I already had that. I wanted every official record connected to the property from the day my grandfather purchased it until the present. If this situation eventually reached a courtroom, I wanted facts arranged so clearly that nobody could misunderstand them. The clerk recognized my family name immediately and smiled. Within 20 minutes, she rolled out several archive boxes containing surveys, easement records, drainage permits, aerial photographs, and county filings dating back decades. As I carefully unfolded each document, the soft crackle of aging paper echoed across the quiet room. Every page confirmed the same simple reality. The property boundaries had never changed. No transfer had ever been recorded. No public dedication had ever been filed. No easement authorized recreational improvements. Legally speaking, the meadow remained exactly what it had always been, privately owned family property. What had changed was the amount of money the Homeowners Association had already invested into pretending otherwise. Before leaving, I requested certified copies of every relevant record and added them to my growing file. On my way back, I stopped beside the meadow once again. The afternoon sun reflected off polished park benches while automatic sprinklers sprayed neat circles across fresh sod. The sweet smell of watered grass drifted through the warm air as residents enjoyed a place they sincerely believed belonged to everyone. I could not blame them. Most had probably trusted what they had been told. Victoria stood near the entrance greeting visitors with the confidence of someone hosting a successful community event. She waved when she noticed my truck and walked over with the same polished smile she always wore. She asked whether I had finally decided to support the project. I answered honestly. I told her I had spent the morning reviewing county records instead. Her smile barely changed. She replied that paperwork often takes time to catch up with community progress and assured me everything had been reviewed by professionals. I simply nodded. Experience had taught me that people who repeatedly insist everything is legal often spend very little time checking whether it actually is. Before leaving, I handed her another envelope containing a copy of my formal request for removal along with certified property maps highlighting every improvement installed beyond the boundary. She accepted the documents without even opening them. Instead, she tucked them beneath a folder and turned back toward a television reporter preparing another interview beside the monument. Cameras began recording while cheerful music played through portable speakers. Families gathered behind her smiling for another promotional segment celebrating neighborhood unity. I climbed back into my truck and quietly drove away. That evening, I organized every photograph by date, every certified letter by delivery confirmation, every invoice, newsletter, email, and public statement into separate folders. I even saved screenshots of the Homeowners Association social media posts announcing each new improvement because they established exactly when every installation occurred. My office gradually looked less like an engineering workspace and more like an evidence archive. The sound of pages sliding into document protectors continued well past sunset, while the old desk lamp illuminated maps my grandfather had drawn decades earlier. Somewhere across the meadow, pathway lights automatically switched on as another peaceful evening settled over the neighborhood. Victoria probably looked out her window and saw a thriving community project. I looked at the same lights and saw another timestamp, another documented improvement, another page added to a file that was becoming impossible to ignore. She believed time was strengthening her position. I knew it was strengthening mine. The breakthrough arrived on a rainy Tuesday morning when the steady tapping of water against the barn roof blended with the quiet rustle of old survey maps spread across my grandfather's drafting table. I had already reviewed every county record twice, but experience had taught me that important answers often hide inside documents everyone else believes they already understand. A civil engineering project is never just one drawing. It is layers of approvals, revisions, maintenance notes, inspections, and references that connect together like pieces of a much larger puzzle. I reached for a weathered binder labeled Drainage Improvements, 1978. The leather cover had faded from decades of use, and the pages carried the familiar scent of aging paper mixed with machine oil from years spent inside the workshop. As I carefully turned each page, one folded attachment caught my attention because it was printed on heavier paper than everything around it. It was not simply another survey. It was the original drainage maintenance agreement my grandfather had signed with the county when the Eastern Meadow was incorporated into the area's long-term stormwater management plan. The language was remarkably clear. The designated drainage corridor was required to remain free of unauthorized permanent landscaping or obstructions that could interfere with water movement or future maintenance access. I leaned back in my chair and read the document again, this time more slowly. Every ornamental tree Victoria had planted sat directly inside that protected corridor. Every irrigation trench crossed the maintenance area. Even several decorative stone borders extended into the recorded easement. None of those improvements had existed when the county last inspected the property. I opened another folder containing aerial photographs from previous engineering assessments and placed them beside the current images I had taken over the past week. The difference was impossible to miss. The open meadow my grandfather intentionally preserved had become a landscape park built precisely where the agreement prohibited unauthorized installations. Outside, rainwater flowed naturally across the field exactly as the engineering drawings predicted decades earlier. Watching that gentle sheet of water move between the newly planted trees made something else immediately obvious. Those expensive trees were never supposed to be there in the first place. I contacted a longtime colleague named Laura Mitchell, a licensed land surveyor I had worked with on several county infrastructure projects. She arrived that afternoon wearing muddy work boots, carrying a total station and a thick binder of county mapping records. The cool air smelled of wet grass and cedar as we walked the property together. Without saying much, Laura verified every original boundary marker, located the recorded drainage easement, and compared the coordinates with the improvements installed by the homeowners association. Her measurements matched mine almost perfectly. She lowered her instrument, looked across the decorative park, and quietly said, "Caleb, this entire project sits exactly where it never should have been." Hearing another professional reach the same conclusion removed the last trace of uncertainty. This was no longer just my opinion supported by family records. Independent measurements confirmed every concern. Before leaving, Laura prepared a signed survey report documenting the location of each major installation relative to the recorded property boundary and drainage corridor. That report joined the growing stack of evidence already filling my office. The next morning, I visited the county engineering department. The receptionist recognized me immediately and directed me to an engineer I had collaborated with several times over the years. After reviewing the original maintenance agreement and Laura's survey, he quietly shook his head. He explained that any work inside a recorded drainage corridor typically required review before construction because future maintenance access had to remain available. He did not speculate about responsibility or outcomes. He simply confirmed that the documents accurately described the protected area. That was all I needed. Driving home, I passed the meadow once again. Families enjoyed the walking paths while sprinklers quietly sprayed water across rows of healthy young trees. Victoria stood beside the entrance monument greeting visitors with effortless confidence, completely unaware that the strongest piece of evidence had never come from an argument, a confrontation, or an angry conversation. It had been sitting inside a forgotten engineering binder for nearly half a century, waiting for someone patient enough to read every page. I spent the next 2 days doing almost nothing that anyone outside my profession would consider exciting, but every hour mattered. I scheduled meetings instead of arguments. I made phone calls instead of accusations. The soft clicking of my keyboard replaced the temptation to confront Victoria face to face because I knew emotions disappear while documentation lasts forever. By Wednesday afternoon, my office desk had become a carefully organized command center. On the left sat certified property records, survey maps, and the original drainage maintenance agreement. In the middle rested Laura Mitchell's signed survey report, with every improvement clearly marked against the legal boundary. On the right were photographs arranged by date, contractor invoices I had obtained through public records requests, copies of my certified letters, delivery confirmations, and screenshots from the homeowners association announcing each stage of construction. Looking across the desk felt less like preparing for a dispute and more like assembling the final pages of a technical report. Every document supported the next one. Every date matched another piece of evidence. Nothing depended on memory. Everything depended on facts. Thursday morning, I met with an attorney whose practice focused almost entirely on property rights and land use issues. His office overlooked the courthouse square, and the smell of fresh coffee mixed with old law books filled the conference room while he quietly worked through the stack of documents. Nearly 40 minutes passed before he finally leaned back in his chair. He did not begin by discussing lawsuits or dramatic courtroom victories. Instead, he smiled slightly and asked one simple question. Did they really receive every certified notice before continuing construction? I slid the delivery confirmations across the table. Every signature, every timestamp, and every receipt sat neatly in chronological order. He nodded once, closed the folder, and said, "That was the smartest decision you made." He explained that the goal was not to surprise anyone. The goal was to demonstrate that they had been given repeated opportunities to correct the problem voluntarily. That distinction mattered. We prepared one final formal notice addressed to the homeowners association, its board members, and every contractor whose company had continued installing improvements after receiving written notice. The letter was direct, professional, and completely factual. It identified the recorded property boundaries, referenced the drainage agreement, attached the independent survey, and established a final deadline for voluntary removal before I exercised my rights as the property owner through lawful means. No threats, no emotional language, just documented facts supported by certified records. By Friday afternoon, every recipient had received the package. The waiting began. Saturday arrived with bright sunshine, and the park looked busier than ever. Food trucks lined the entrance while families gathered beneath colorful tents for another neighborhood celebration. Acoustic music drifted across the meadow, blending with children's laughter and the gentle hiss of sprinklers cooling the freshly planted trees. I parked along the county road and watched from a distance. Victoria moved through the crowd wearing another bright designer outfit, greeting residents with the confidence of someone convinced the story had already reached its happy ending. Several people waved at me politely, unaware that nearly everyone standing there was enjoying a space built on a legal mistake that had already been documented from every possible angle. Monday morning arrived without a response from the association. Tuesday passed just as quietly. No contractor contacted me. No board member requested a meeting. Instead, another social media post appeared celebrating future expansion plans, including additional shade trees and permanent picnic structures. I saved another screenshot and placed it inside the evidence file. Late that afternoon, my attorney called. His voice remained calm, almost routine. The deadline had expired without compliance. Every legal requirement had now been satisfied. We could move forward with the next step. I looked out the window, toward the meadow where the evening breeze gently moved through rows of perfectly healthy trees. The same trees that had impressed visitors only days earlier had now become carefully documented unauthorized improvements occupying private land inside a protected drainage corridor. I picked up the phone one more time, not to call Victoria, but to schedule a licensed arborist company experienced in transplanting mature trees and restoring disturbed property. I also arranged for a licensed survey crew to mark every boundary before work began and requested that local officials be notified of the scheduled restoration so the process could proceed transparently. Everything would happen in daylight. Everything would be documented. Everything would follow the law exactly the way my grandfather always believed it should. The countdown had finally begun, and for the first time since I drove past that ribbon-cutting ceremony, I felt completely at peace. Wednesday morning arrived with clear skies, cool air, and the steady sound of diesel engines rolling slowly down the county road. This time, they were not delivering landscaping materials. They belonged to the licensed arborist company I had hired nearly a week earlier. Their trucks carried tree spades, survey flags, and restoration equipment instead of decorative benches and flower beds. The scent of fresh coffee drifted from one crew member's travel mug while another carefully unloaded measuring equipment beside Laura Mitchell, who had returned to verify every property marker before a single machine crossed the boundary. My attorney arrived a few minutes later carrying the same organized binder we had assembled together. Shortly afterward, representatives from the county engineering department and local code enforcement checked in, reviewed the documentation, and confirmed the restoration work matched the recorded property boundaries and protected drainage corridor. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody argued. The entire morning felt surprisingly quiet. By 8:30, every boundary stake had been re-established exactly where my grandfather's original survey placed it decades earlier. Bright orange markers stretched across the meadow like a perfectly straight line separating appearance from ownership. Families walking the trail slowed to watch, while neighbors gathered near the entrance monument trying to understand why so many professionals had arrived at once. Then Victoria's white sport utility vehicle swept into the parking area much faster than usual. She stepped out wearing another colorful designer jacket, oversized sunglasses, and an expression that suggested she expected another public relations opportunity. The confidence lasted only until my attorney handed her the final documentation. I stood several yards away listening as he calmly explained that repeated written notices had been delivered, the deadline had expired, independent surveys confirmed every unauthorized installation, and restoration of private property would now proceed. Victoria flipped through the pages, stopping occasionally to look toward the survey markers stretching across the meadow. For the first time since I had met her, she seemed genuinely uncertain. She insisted the project benefited the entire community. She argued that volunteers had invested countless hours planting every tree. She pointed toward smiling families enjoying the walking paths, as though popularity somehow changed recorded property lines. My attorney simply replied that community support could never transfer ownership of private land. The conversation lasted only a few minutes before the first arborist operator received approval to begin. The large hydraulic tree spade moved slowly toward the nearest maple with remarkable precision. Steel blades disappeared into the soil, surrounding the root ball without damaging the trunk. A few moments later, the entire tree lifted smoothly from the ground and settled carefully onto a transport trailer. There was no chaos, no rushing, just experienced professionals performing the work they had been hired to do. One by one, the ornamental trees disappeared from the meadow exactly as they had arrived, except this time every movement followed documented property rights instead of assumptions. The gentle hiss of the irrigation system continued until another crew disconnected each line, capped the connections, and removed the piping section by section. Decorative benches were loaded onto flatbed trailers. Stone borders were stacked neatly onto pallets. The wooden signs identifying different tree species disappeared almost as quickly as they had been installed. Even the entrance monument wrapped in protective blankets before being lifted away by a crane because it also rested inside the recorded boundary. Neighbors watched quietly from behind temporary safety barriers while county representatives observed the process and occasionally compared field conditions with the survey maps. Nobody interfered because every step had already been documented, reviewed, and scheduled. Victoria remained near the edge of the meadow, speaking into her phone repeatedly, but each conversation seemed shorter than the last. As the afternoon sun climbed higher, more open ground slowly reappeared beneath the departing equipment. The meadow my grandfather had intentionally preserved began emerging once again from beneath weeks of expensive landscaping. Standing beside the old fence, I listened to the familiar breeze moving across open grass instead of through rows of ornamental trees. The view felt strangely familiar, as though the land itself had been patiently waiting for someone to remember what it had always been designed to become. By sunset, nearly every unauthorized improvement had been removed, leaving only survey stakes, fresh soil, and the quiet certainty that facts had finally caught up with appearances. By the following weekend, the meadow looked almost exactly the way I remembered it from childhood. The decorative walkways were gone. The irrigation lines had been carefully removed. The ornamental trees had all been relocated by the licensed arborists. Freshly restored soil stretched across the open field, and after a light rain, the familiar scent of damp earth drifted through the morning air just as it had for decades. Standing beside the old cottonwood tree, I could once again hear the breeze moving naturally across the open drainage corridor without anything interrupting its path. It was quiet, simple, and honest, the way my grandfather always intended it to be. A few days later, I received a formal notice confirming that the Homeowners Association would be responsible for substantial restoration expenses associated with the unauthorized improvements. Additional discussions between the association, its contractors, and their insurance representatives continued for weeks afterward, but that part no longer belonged to me. My responsibility had always been protecting the property, not deciding how everyone else sorted out the consequences of their own decisions. What surprised me most was not the paperwork. It was the change in the neighborhood itself. Neighbors who had barely spoken to me before began stopping by the fence to apologize for believing the project had been approved. Several admitted they had simply assumed the Homeowners Association had verified ownership before announcing such an ambitious plan. Others quietly thanked me because the situation encouraged them to start reading community documents more carefully instead of accepting every decision without asking questions. Even Daniel Foster smiled one afternoon as we leaned against the old fence watching deer return to the meadow for the first time in weeks. He laughed softly and said, "Turns out your grandfather knew more about that field than an entire board of directors." I smiled because he was right. Grandpa never cared about winning arguments. He cared about doing things correctly the first time. Before leaving the property that evening, I walked back into the old equipment shed and carefully returned every survey, every permit, every maintenance agreement, and every handwritten notebook to the same filing cabinet where my grandfather had stored them all those years ago. The familiar sound of the drawer sliding closed echoed through the quiet building. Those documents had never needed dramatic speeches or public attention. They had simply waited patiently until someone respected them enough to read every page. Looking back now, I realized the most important lesson had very little to do with property lines. It was about patience. There were plenty of opportunities to react emotionally during those first few weeks. I could have argued at the ribbon cutting. I could have shouted across the meadow or tried to embarrass someone in front of the cameras. None of that would have restored the land. Quiet preparation accomplished what frustration never could. Facts stayed consistent while opinions changed almost every day. My grandfather used to say that land remembers everyone who respects it and quietly outlasts everyone who does not. Standing there beneath the same cottonwood tree where I carved my initials as a boy, I finally understood exactly what he meant. The meadow did not need revenge. It needed someone willing to protect it the right way. Justice rarely arrives with applause. Most of the time, it arrives inside organized folders, careful measurements, certified letters, and people willing to let the truth speak for itself. As I locked the barn and looked across the restored field one last time, I felt something far more satisfying than victory. I felt peace. If you watch this story all the way to the end, I would genuinely like to know your thoughts. Do you think I handled the situation the right way, or would you have done something differently? Share your opinion in the comments, because I enjoy reading how different people would approach moments like this. And if stories about standing up for your rights through patience, preparation, and lawful action are the kind of stories you enjoy, consider subscribing so you do not miss the next one. After everything that happened here, one lesson stayed with me more than any other. Justice is not loud. It is patient, documented, and inevitable.